So this is an initiative from two NGOs who working in Kerala, uh, Kottayam Nature Society and Alapi Naturalist Society. They do a lot of ground level conservation works. I mean, and today we are lucky to have Dr. Roy. He's been studying skinks. I mean, I've been photographing skinks for probably 10, 15 years. So every time when I get confused, people always come to me and tell, "Oh, you should send it to Roy." And with so I never did that. I mean, we always keep all the species photos with us. Anyway, we are hoping to learn a lot today. Thank you so much for agreeing to give a talk today. Over to you, Andrew.
All right. Thanks, David. So, as I hope I'm audible. Um,
Yes, you're audible.
all right. So, as I understand from David and speaking to a few others, so this audience, the set of audience for these talks largely consists of students, a few scientists, but it's majorly nature enthusiasts who may not have had any formal training in specific fields of biology that this series of talks have covered so far. So what I'll do is, and I'll try and therefore reduce as much jargon as possible. So as a part of my work, I practice taxonomy and systematics in my lab, and I'm sure you're aware that most taxonomists are like lawyers. They just like to talk a lot of jargon. So us, taxonomists, we think that everyone is well aware of all these terminologies. So I'll try and uh, avoid that as much as possible. But if I do spit any jargon, apologies in advance, and you can always ask me in the chat. All right. So the outline of this presentation is fairly simple. The whole talk is going to be about why skinks are awesome. That's it. So the whole idea being, spreading awareness about skinks. Therefore, in this talk, we will look at skinks in a global perspective, but it will be generously sprinkled with stuff of with sprinkled with information about skinks from India. And another motive of this talk is also to highlight potential questions that one can ask using skinks as a model system. All right. So skinks, as everyone is aware, all right. Skinks, as everyone is aware, are squamates, and squamates are basically, scaly reptiles. And there are a bunch of characters that define squamates. For example, you have these scales, but it's not just the scales, because even fish have scales, but fish are not squamates. Then you have you have movable jaws. You also have the ability to shed skin, and another very telltale sign of a squamate is that it has a paired intromittent male organ, which is also called hemipenis. And this is what the phylogeny of squamates look like. So a phylogeny, just for people who are not familiar with phylogeny, so phylogeny is nothing but an evolutionary tree. Okay, so these are all the different members of the squamates on this side of the phylogeny, and this tree basically, this evolutionary tree basically shows how these different lineages are related to one another. All right. So, for example, just to give you an example, so you have Serpentis here, which includes all the snakes, and you have Anguimorpha and Iguana here, the Iguania here. So this just basically says that Serpentis is more closely related to Iguania and Anguimorpha than Serpentis is related to Geckota. So that's about it. All right. Now, why did I give this specific example? Because what we are going to be talking about is in this particular group called Skinkoidea. I will zoom into what Skinkoidea is, but what I want you to notice is that these skinks, which are present in Skinkoidea, are actually very distant from Serpentis. Now, if you, I'm sure in a lot of languages, for example, in Hindi, skinks are called Saap ki Mausi. In Marathi, they are called Sapachi Maushi or something. Marathis, please don't kill me if I've pronounced it wrong. In Bengali, it's called Shapir Mashi. In Kannada, it's called Bhavarani. So all of these have connotations which show that it is somehow related to snakes. But as you can see from this phylogeny, they're actually not closely related to snakes. All right. So what I'll do is I'll zoom into this particular group, which is Skinkoidea. So the Skinkoidea is basically formed of these 4 families: Skinkidae, Cordylidae, Gerosauridae, and Xanthusidae. All right. And what we are interested in and what we are talking about today is Skinkidae. And this group basically evolved about 100 to 150 million years ago. And this is based on multiple studies that have involved fossil evidence. And skinks basically look like this. They have, this is what a typical skinks look like. Typical skink looks like. It has a very snake-like body. It has a very shiny skin. And these skinks are related to these 3 other families, Xanthusids. So these Xanthusids are also called night lizards. And so skinks, by the way, are found almost all over the world. So Xanthusids are found mostly in Central America. And then you have Gerosaurids, which are also called as plated lizards, and they are native to Africa and Madagascar. And you also have Cordylids, which are also called spiny-tailed lizards, and they are native to Africa and Madagascar. All right, so I'm not going to give you like a full jargonesque taxonomic definition of what skinks are, because that involves a lot of scale morphology, tongue musculature, and all that. So I'm sure everyone, when you go out to the field, you kind of know what a skink looks like. So I'm going to just build upon that. And so what are skinks in general? So they are small to medium sized. So they are, of course, lizards, now that you know that. So they are small to medium sized, and they're mostly diurnal. So this is the smallest skink in the world, which is called Pygmaeus skincus sadleri, and is found in New Guinea. And the adult is about 2.3 centimeters, which can literally fit on your fingertip, right? And then you have the largest limbless skink. So of course, in case you were not aware, there are limbed skinks and there are limbless skinks also. I'll get into these details later on. So the largest limbless skink is about 50 centimeters long. But the largest skink in the world is this skink called Corucia zebrata. It's also called monkey skink. And this will keep popping up a lot in this presentation because it is really interesting in multiple ways. So this Corucia zebrata can grow up to 70 centimeter, which is as long or maybe longer than your arm. This skink Corucia zebrata also seems to be very popular among pet traders. So this is this is generally looking at what the price is for these monkey skinks. Turns out some of these are selling for $1,200, which is so these skinks are found in Solomon Islands, which are an island archipelago of the coast of Australia and New Guinea. So they're selling this skink for $1,200, which is enough to start like a short-term project in India. So they are especially revered as pets. All right. So skinks also have smooth, shiny imbricate scales. Okay. So again, technical jargon. So imbricate basically means overlapping. So here is a photograph which includes 4 different types of lizards. So here, if you can see my cursor, here is a lacertid. This is a picture of the dorsum or the back of Acanthodactylus, which is a lacertid. This is an agamid, for example, Calotus. So this is an agamid. This is a gecko, for example, Hemidactylus, the house geckos that you see. And this is what a typical skink looks like. And just by looking at these,
Sorry to butt in. I think we can't see your cursor. Probably use a. Can you show it again, please?
can you see anything now?
No.
Okay, so I'll just
Probably use a laser
point it
pointer.
out.
Yeah, laser pointer. Yeah.
Laser pointer, you can see it?
Yeah, now it's visible. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So
Perfect. Thank you.
this, all right. So this is a lacertid dorsum, lacertid back. This is an agamid. This is a skink, and this is a gecko. And just by looking at this picture, you can see that the skink scales are much more shinier than all the others. Just before I forget, so this is, remember, this is a picture of what the scales look like in this lacertid called Acanthodactylus. But there are other lacertids also where the scales look very, very different. All right. But the whole point of the matter why I wanted to show this is that skink scales are much shinier than many others. So quite often I've seen people mistake skinks with another lacertid called Ophisops because they sort of look similar, but Ophisops scales are not shiny. So that's one telltale sign. All right. So they also, skinks also have well-developed head shields. And what do I mean by that? Again, so this is a lacertid, this is a skink, this is a Hemidactylus gecko, and this is an agamid. And you can see that you have these head plates or these really large shields only in skinks and the lacertids, whereas the agamids and the Hemidactylus actually don't have these. So the identification can be problematic because there are a lot of different characters, but they're largely based on, dorsal. So, for example, these characters that I just showed. So it can be based on the arrangement of how these scales are, or how these scales are, which are called nuchals, or how many scales there are from here to till the end of the body, till where the tail starts. So there are multiple characters, and I'm sure similar protocols are also followed in other reptiles also. It's basically based on dorsal ventral head scalation and also lower eyelid morphology. Because you have some skinks which when they close their eyes, you will notice that they actually have a scaly lower eyelid, right? So it's a lower eyelid that moves. So it's a scaly lower eyelid. Whereas in some other skinks, there is a transparent window. All right. But more recent studies have actually shown that this is probably not a great character to differentiate between species because it can be very labile. All right. So there are these characters where the lower eyelid is actually closing, and you have these either scaly eyelid or you have the transparent eyelid. But you also have another kind of eye, which is, so this is what is called as an ablepharine eye. And this is a photograph of Ablepharus graianus. And this is a skink that is found in north and northwest India. And this does not have eyelids. Well, what really happened is that the lower eyelid is permanently joined with the upper one, and the eyelid became it almost became like Ray-Ban sunglasses. So it's basically a few studies have shown that these actually provide UV protection. Another thing that I want you to notice here is that these are called ablepharine eyes because they're they are round, and they're very different from some of the other skink eyes. And they lack what we call as a palpebral slit. Now, what do I mean by a palpebral slit? Look at this particular photograph and look at this particular photograph. Now you have this particular region which is called a palpebral slit, which is where the slit occurs between the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. Whereas here, this is pretty much round, right? So it completely lacks a palpebral slit. All right. Here are some other characters that can be used in skinks. So there are some skinks have keels. So these keels are basically these ridge-like um, structures on the scales. So they can be anything from a single keel to multiple, more than four, more than five keels. There are also some skinks that have no keels. All right. So I'll come back to keels in a bit, but then you also have other characters like the gulas. So these are called the gular scales, and these are called the ventral scales. So all basically a khichdi of all these characters are used in order to identify. So if you want to describe a new species, you have to look at all these characters. Right. About keels. Um, so there's been a lot of discussion about what the significance of these keels are, right? So there are multiple hypotheses. One of the hypotheses says that they're probably to reduce light reflection. Now, because the skinks have really shiny scales, what these keels do is basically make sure that the scales are not as shiny. So they kind of reflecting it in different directions. Another hypothesis that people have proposed is that it kind of blurs the outline of the skink, and this is for a predator. So while a predator is looking from the top or somewhere else, in order to gauge whether it is a potential skink or not, or it's a potential prey or not, these keels, if they're big enough, might be able to blur their outline, which can obviously help protect them. There's another hypothesis which says that these keels might might help in climbing, because they can increase the friction while they're climbing. But well, if you think about it, most of these lizards, when they climb, they use their lower surface, and we're talking about the top surface. In fact, there are these other lizards called anolis lizards, and one of the species of anolis lizards also has keels on the ventrals. Ventral meaning the bottom part, the belly part. There's also another hypothesis that says that these keels probably help in water retention. So maybe skinks that are in completely dry areas, if they happen to, if there's rain or something, there's water will be retained. Water will retain on these keels, which so it can retain moisture for a long time, right? So there are these various different hypotheses. There's also another hypothesis that says that these keels are there in these skinks because of phylogenetic inertia. All right, technical jargon. What do I mean by phylogenetic inertia? So let's say these are all skinks of the genus Eutropis. These are also called sun skinks, and all Eutropis have these keels. And what I'm saying is that these Eutropis species, all these Eutropis species, probably have these keels because of phylogenetic inertia. Now, what do I mean by that and how? Okay, so let's say there is a species X, which 50 million years ago, that was the ancestor of all the living Eutropis species that you see today. And this ancestral species happens to be keeled. All right. So now this keeled ancestor diversifies into multiple species over time from 50 million years till today. So this is 50 million years, and so let's say this is today. So evolution has basically resulted in a number of different species where each um, ending horizontal line is a new species today. However, uh, along none of these evolutionary lines, it was possible to get rid of these keels simply because of um, developmental reasons, or simply because of a lack of developmental options. And therefore, all the species that we see today have descended from a keeled ancestor, right? So all these species that have keels today have descended from a keeled ancestor. So uh, largely because there was a lack of evolutionary pathway to get rid of these keels. So I hope I made that clear. Another very crude way of looking at it, looking at phylogenetic inertia, is see, elephants can't grow wings because they just lack the evolutionary means to grow wings. So that's phylogenetic inertia, but this is a very oversimplified form. All right. So why are skinks interesting? Um, so skinks are very, very interesting because there's a humongous diversity. When you talk about numbers, there are about 180 genera. This might be old numbers, but if you look at the reptile database today, there are about 1,685 species across the world, and this accounts for 25% of the world lizard diversity, right? But that isn't the only reason why skinks are interesting. Skinks are interesting because they actually show a diversity of traits, and therefore they are excellent model systems for studying various evolution of traits. Uh, the other thing is we actually don't know much of these the natural history of many of these species, or the significance of these morphological traits. So what I'm going to do during the course of this presentation is talk about some of these traits that make skinks very interesting. First and foremost is limblessness in skinks, because uh, there are very less instances of a gradation of limblessness uh, within a single family. And what do I mean by that? So let's take this particular. So this is a very typical, what you would perceive as a very typical skink. It has a snake-like body, but it is still quite robust, and it has these robust limbs which are pentadactyl. And when I say pentadactyl, they have 5 fingers and 5 toes. 5 fingers and 5 toes, right? So this is one type of skink which is very robust bodied, has a robust body, and has well developed limbs. You can also have this type of skink which has a much more slender body. So this is a skink called Castlia, and it's endemic to the Western Ghats. So this has a much more slender body in comparison to the photograph that I had shown earlier, and even the limbs are they look much weaker, right, than the previous one. Although this one is also pentadactyl, so it has 5 fingers and 5 toes. You can also have this kind of skink. So this is a skink called Ophiomorus. This is also called sandfish, and this is a skink that you will, if you go to the Thar Desert, you will find these skinks. And the reason why I'm showing you these skinks is that they lack, they don't have pentadactyl digits, so they have only 3 fingers, right? And surprise, surprise, why would they even need well-developed limbs, right? Because they stay in the dunes, so they don't really require. So through evolutionary time, they have actually their digits have reduced. You can also have this kind of skink which is completely limbless. So this is an endemic skink from India called Sepsophis. It's also a monotypic genus, and when I say a monotypic genus, I mean that there's only one species within this genus. right? So this is a species called Sepsophis punctatus. And this limbless skink, well, if you look at the close-up of this part, you would see that it has a small spur-like structure that is vestigial, and obviously it cannot use this for locomotion. And needless to say, this is a skink that is burrowing, and these are found in high elevation evergreen forests in the eastern Ghats. This is another skink that you find in the coastal regions in the eastern coast in areas surrounding Vizag. And unlike Sepsophis, which had a short muscular spur, Barkudia, this is a genus called Barkudia. So this Barkudia is completely limbless, right? Now, these are all Indian skinks that I've showed, but then there are also other really cool examples. For example, this is a skink from Madagascar. So it was described as Cyranoscincus moby but currently it is called Voeltzkovia moby and it's called moby because it resembles the the fictional whale Moby Dick, the sperm whale Moby Dick, which was also an albino. So this is an albino creature, and it looks like this, just like Moby Dick. This it doesn't have any hind limbs, but the forelimbs have been reduced to these flipper-like structures, right? And it stays in these sandy, loamy soil uh, or sandy, loamy areas. All right. Now, what about the habitat of these skinks? So most skinks tend to be terrestrial, well, on top of the ground. And I'm sure most of you have seen these skinks. So this is a Eutropis macularia, and this is a Lygosoma punctata, and I'm sure you would have seen this in the garden just outside your house. But there are also skinks that are fossorial or arenicolous. And remember, again, jargon. Uh, when I say arenicolous or fossorial, I basically mean that these are burrowing and stay in sandy, loamy soil. And examples of these are these limbless forms of skinks. For example, Barkudia melanosecta, which is found in the eastern coast. And this is found in coastal, very sandy soils. For example, if you go to Vizag and if you dig around some of these places, if you dig under a shaded tree, which is close to the coast, you will find these limbless skinks. And you also have Sepsophis punctatus, which is found in high elevation evergreen forests of the eastern Ghats, where the soil is soft enough for them to dig. And needless to say, the snout of these skinks, all of these skinks are very chitinous, so they have a very strong snout, which they use in order to dig. And you'd be surprised by how efficient they are in burrowing. This is also another skink that is found in and around offshoots of northern Western Ghats near Maharashtra. It's called Eurylepis punaensis. All right. So there are also aquatic skinks. For example, this is a species that you find in Northeast India. It's called Tropidophorus assamensis. And this is another species that you find, Amphiglossus, which you find in Madagascar. And these species, I'm saying these species are aquatic because some of these species actually forage. When I say forage, they actually look for food. They actually forage in water, or if they face any danger, they can actually run into water, or they can just go underwater and stay there for a while. All right. And I actually have not seen any photographs of swimming skinks from India, but I was generally looking at it, and it seems like skinks can swim in multiple ways. They can either swim using all of their limbs, both their forelimbs and their hind limbs, or it seems like many of the skinks actually swim by using only their forelimbs and use their tail. So the hind limbs are basically tucked along with their tail. There are also arboreal skinks or tree-dwelling skinks. For example, this is an endemic species found in southern India called, and this is from the genus called Dacia. The species is called Johnsinghi, and then it's named after one of the best scientists in our country, Dr. John Singh. So this is another skink called Lamprolepis maragdina, which is found in Southeast Asia. And this is the monkey skink that I was telling about. So these are called monkey skinks because they hang around on trees all the time. And these skinks also have a prehensile tail. Okay. All right. So this is going to come back again because this is actually a really, really cool skink. It's going to come back again for another character. Now here's another really cool thing. So this is a skink called Spinomorphus praelangensis, which was described late last year. And it's a skink that is found in Cambodia, and it's called praelangensis based on the Praelang wildlife sanctuary in Cambodia. And in this photograph, what you see is this new species. This is actually not water. This is actually a resin that is collected from these trees. So many of in Cambodia, many of the locals, they make these cuts on these trees and they place a cup-like structure to collect the resin. And this resin is actually used as ingredients in paints or some other products. And looks like this skink. This skink has been observed actually hanging around in this resin, and looks like this resin does no apparent harm to this skink. All right. So skinks can also be rupicolous or saxicolous, with that I mean that they love rocks. So they are rock-dwelling skinks. For example, this skink called Niveoscincus greeni. So this is a skink that you find in New Zealand, and this particular species is especially found quite frequently above the snow line. Now, whether they actively forage above the snow line or not is not known, but they are definitely associated with rocks, and they live in rock crevices. All right, so if you think that wasn't cool enough, there are also skinks with digital pads. Now, I'm sure you've heard about digital pads in geckos, and you're probably aware that digital pads in geckos actually evolved independently about 11 times and was lost about 9 times. Now, what do I mean by this independent acquiring of a character and losing a character? This will get clearer in a couple of slides when I'm explaining a different trait. But for now, just go with me. So my point was that you see a lot of these climbing. This climbing trait you largely see in geckos, and for the longest time, it was thought that geckos have these suction pads, which help them to climb walls or climb vertical surfaces. But a lot of research has gone into it, and it turns out if you close in on their foot, they have these the underside of their toes are made of these leaf-like structures which are called lamellae. And if you look very closely at these lamellae are made up of really small filament-like structures called setae, right? And each of these setae end up with a very small, very tiny microscopic flat surface, right? And these surfaces are so small that they interact with whatever surface that this gecko wants to walk on. And there are these forces called van der Waals forces, with which they actually stick onto vertical walls, um, which I find very funny, because geckos climb on walls because of van der Waals. But turns out it's not just in geckos. There's also This is also independently arisen in a couple of species of anoles. So this is an anolis lizards with which is found along Caribbean islands and North America. And although um, their cetal arrangement is not very similar to geckos, they still are quite efficient in climbing vertical walls. But there is one skink called Prasinohema virens, which is found in New Guinea Islands. And these have these small setae-like structures, which are exactly like geckos. And they can actually climb vertical walls. Now, there's a reason why these are called. I mean, that's really cool that these skinks. In fact, this is the only skink that has these structures very similar to geckos, which is also very surprising. Um, Now, I want to bring your attention to the name of this particular skink. It's called Prasinohema. So the genus is called Prasinohema, and this basically means green blood, right? Why would you call uh, a genus of skink Prasinohema? Precisely because the skink actually has green blood. It's not just this particular species, but about a bunch of other species within this genus also has green blood, and it looks like this uh, green blood, or this trait of having green blood. I'll get to the details of it later. It looks like this trait of getting green blood has evolved at least 4 times within this genus. All right, what do I mean by it has evolved 4 times? All right, so this is a phylogeny, or this is an evolutionary tree. Okay, so forget all the names, but these are all the Prasinohema species, right? And these red lines indicate red blood. These green lines indicate species that have green blood, right? Now, the reason why I said it's evolved at least 4 times is because, well, just to reiterate, I said that it evolved at least 4 times. But if you see how many species actually have it, you would see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 species that actually have this green blood. Then why did I say that it evolved 4 times? That's because these 3 species are closely related to each other and share this common ancestor. All of these species have green blood, and therefore it is very likely that the common ancestor of all these species would have evolved this character, right? And then you have this particular species, which is completely unrelated to this. So therefore, this character must have evolved independently along this evolutionary line. Similarly, must have evolved along this evolutionary line and this evolutionary line. So there are at least 4 different instances of this green blood character being having evolved in this genus of skinks. Okay, so I was saying that these skinks called Prasinohema actually have green blood. So in many species, including humans, the oxygen in the blood is actually carried by hemoglobin, right, which gives the blood its red color. Now, when this hemoglobin starts to break down, it's transported to the liver, where it's broken down into molecules such as bilirubin and biliverdin. And this bilirubin and biliverdin is immediately excreted along with bile. It gets into the intestine. It's immediately excreted along with bile. Why am I telling you all this? Because even if you have a minute amount of bilirubin or biliverdin in your blood, you basically have jaundice. So that's so when you have jaundice, you have bilirubin and biliverdin in your blood, which means that these bilirubin and biliverdin are actually toxic, right? Even minute quantities in the bloodstream can be toxic. But turns out in these kings, they have 40 times more biliverdin, or they can handle 40 times more biliverdin in their blood than humans. So this is, if you can see the slide, this is what, can you see my cursor?
No.
Can you see the laser pointer? Okay, so basically, so this is what normal blood looks like, and this is what blood from the green skink looks like. And it's not actually not just it's not just the blood; it's also its bones and muscles and even the tongue, which is green in color. Now, why do you think this skink and this skink is still alive in spite of having such high levels of biliverdin? So there's a lot of research that is going on why the skink has can survive in spite of having such high amounts of biliverdin, or why it would evolve to have why these species would evolve to have biliverdin in their blood. And one of the hypotheses is that this biliverdin in the blood can actually deter plasmodium. So, just like humans, even reptiles and birds can be affected by malaria, and this malaria is caused by plasmodium. And if these skinks, when these skinks have biliverdin in their blood, plasmodium can't survive in their blood. So this is ongoing research that is happening. Especially, I know of Christopher Austin who is working on these. All right. So here's another way in which skinks are very interesting. Now, when you think of reptiles and the modes of reproduction, most of the most of the times you would think that these reptiles are egg-laying, and you would be true because many of these skinks actually lay eggs, and some of these skinks are also protect these eggs, right? But turns out, so here's another tidbit that I wanted to share. Many reptiles, if you've ever wondered, how do they actually, when they're really young in the egg, how do they actually tear through the eggshell? So while they're still inside the egg, they develop what is called as the egg tooth, and these are basically sharp sword-like structures near their mouth, and they use these to rip open the eggshell in order to come out, right? Now, why am I telling you about this egg tooth? Because skinks are also ovoviviparous, which means that the females, instead of hatching her eggs immediately, it retains the egg inside her oviduct for a long enough period, or it incubates it inside her for a long enough period, and then hatches it just just a few days before the young one inside the egg is developed enough to hatch out. All right. Now, a problem here when you are ovoviviparous is that when you have these little ones inside the egg, and they have these sharp structures on their mouth, which can potentially, of course, it's used to break eggshells, but can also cut through the mother's oviduct, which is obviously not going to be very pleasant for the mother. So what is really cool is that in many of these skinks, which are ovoviviparous, these egg tooths actually develop much later than in skinks that are ovoviviparous. So they develop maybe a few days before they're about to hatch, and once they hatch, they can always use these tooth to rip through the shell. Right now, there are also viviparous skinks, which means that these skinks actually give live birth. For example, and this is a photograph of Tiliqua rugosa. This is also called a blue-tongued skink. It's also called shingleback. It's also called pine cone skink. Um, so there are a lot of other species of Tiliqua that actually do live birth. Now, what's surprising is that 45 to 50% of all species of skinks are actually viviparous. Because I mean, this is a bit weird, because when you're looking at when you're thinking about reptiles, you always think, okay, just like birds, these also lay eggs and all that, but you never think of skinks, or you never think of reptiles as viviparous. 45% to 50% of all skinks are viviparous, right? So that's really cool. Now, if that is not cool enough, here is some cool overload. I'm sure some of you must have seen news about this particular skink. It's called Cyphos equalis, and it's distributed in Australia, largely in Eastern Australia. So in 2010, there was a study that suggested that which looked at two populations of these skinks called Cyphos equalis, and these they noticed that the same species Cyphos equalis in the high elevation areas are different from the skinks that are in low elevation areas. Now, how are they different? Turns out the skinks in the high elevation areas are viviparous, right? And the skinks in the low elevation areas are oviparous, the same species, right? Now, if you think about it, evolutionary, it probably makes a lot of sense, because when you're in the low area, when you're in the coast, it's much more warmer, and therefore you can afford to actually keep the eggs lying there, incubate there, while the mother goes around searching for food. Whereas in the higher elevations, it is colder, and therefore it makes more sense, if the mother wants the children to survive, it makes more sense for her to actually carry these in her oviduct until they are ready to hatch. Okay, so this was really cool, because it's the same species that is oviparous and viviparous in the highlands, and when you compare the highlands and the lowlands. Early this year, there was obviously since 2010 there's been a lot of research about this. Early this year, they found a particular an individual of this particular species, Cyphos equalis, and in the same pregnancy, it laid the first three were laid as eggs, and the last one was actually a live birth, right? In the same pregnancy, the same individual laid eggs. So it was oviparous and viviparous, the same individual, which is mind blowing. Now, of course, there are differences, because this is how the eggs look like, and the egg shells are actually much. So this is actually the placenta from which the young one is coming out, but the eggshells tend to be much thinner in these species. And there's been a paper that was published last month, which is looking at the gene expression part of this particular trait, where within the same species there's oviparity and viviparity. This can get even more trickier, or even more interesting. So let's look at sex determination here. So there are two ways in which sex determination occurs. It'll be clear of why I'm actually talking about this. So there are two ways in which sex determination can occur. You can either have genotypic sex determination, or you can have temperature dependent sex determination, which is also called TSD, right? So genotypic sex determination is fairly simple, and I'm sure we are all aware of it. So you have XX or XY, and males are XY, females are XX, and because they have two X chromosomes, they are said to be homozygous. And because these are different set of chromosomes, X and Y, they are called heterozygous, right? So while mating, so the X, if it fuses with a Y, you get a male. If the X fuses with another X, you get a female. All simple. This happens in humans. This happens in humans. This happens in quite a few reptiles also. In birds, fish, amphibians, and quite a few other taxa. There's another type of genotypic sex determination called ZZ and ZW, which is very similar to XX and XY, except that it's the other way around. The males are homozygous, whereas the females are heterozygous. On the other hand, you have temperature-dependent sex determination, where uh, the sex of the offspring is actually decided based on what temperature there's a critical period, and during that critical period, what temperature it actually experiences. So, for example, in quite a few turtles, if it experiences more than 32 degrees, it becomes a female. Between 28 and 32 degrees centigrade, it either becomes a male or a female, and lower than 28 degrees centigrade, it becomes a male. And I think Sneha was also talking about this. It also temperature dependent sex determination is also there in crocs. But the reason why I'm saying this is because this is independent of this, right? Except that it would be wrong, because there is a species called Acridoscincus dupere, which is also distributed in Australia. Turns out this has a combination of genotypic sex determination, temperature dependent sex determination, and its sex can also be determined based on how much yolk you have, right? So you can, so this, just to remind, this particular species has an XX-XY sex determination mechanism, right? So, where an XY is a male and an XX is a female, right? So let's say there's an XY and it's male, right? But then that male at a particular critical period experiences a particular temperature which can actually convert its sex. So the chromosome remains the same. The chromosome is male, but the sex becomes female, which is very, very weird. Now, there's another third step where if you increase or decrease the yolk amount in the egg, that can also change the sex. And I'd like to point out that this study was largely done by um, this person called Raju Radav, who was doing his postdoc in Richard Shine's lab in Australia. And he did a lot of seminal work on reproductive biology of many of these lizards. And he unfortunately passed away at the young age of 34 in 2008. Now, why did I talk about all of this? Because there are these two Indian skinks. One of them is called Spinomorphus indicus. Another of them is Assemblypharus himalayanus. And I'm showing you the photographs of these skinks because Spinomorphus indicus also is an exemplar of the same species being present in the lowland and in high elevation areas. Same goes for Assemblypharus himalayanus. For people who have gone to Dehradun and Mussoorie, you will find when you come to the Doon Valley, you will find this species. When you go to Mussoorie, you'll find the same species. Although, as a disclaimer, I must say that the taxonomy of these species has not been worked out. So it is very likely that the high elevation one and the low elevation one might be different species. All right, coming to the diet of skinks. Most of the skinks are carnivorous, as you can see, and they eat a lot of these um, grasshopper, locusts, and worms like candy. Many of the skinks are also herbivorous, and they can be facultatively omnivorous as well. For example, this particular skink, which I was referring to as the monkey skink, the Corokia zebrata from Solomon Islands, this is exclusively herbivorous. Um, Now remember that in order to be herbivorous, you also need to have the gut flora to be able to break the cellulose, the plant cellulose material. Also, the other thing that is really cool about Corokia zebrata is that it can eat um, fruits or parts of plant that are otherwise toxic. So, and it does it no harm. So it can easily withstand all these toxins. There are also coprophagous skinks. And when I say coprophagous, that means that they feed on feces. And an example of coprophagous skink is again Corokia zebrata. Of course, there are other skinks which feed on feces, but the reason why I said Corokia zebrata is because these Corokia zebrata, when the young ones of these species, they don't have the, the bacterial flora in their stomach to be able to break down plant cellulose material, right? So, unlike a lot of parents who would probably make sure that their sons or daughters don't go around eating feces, these skinks actually encourage their young ones to eat the feces of the adults. And the reason being, the feces of these adults actually contain the biota or the flora, bacterial flora required in order to break down plant cellulose material. There are also saprophagous skinks, which means that they feed on dead and decaying. And skinks can also be cannibalistic. Now, skinks themselves are predators, exclusive prey to quite a few predators. There is an example of a particular snake which eats only skinks. So it prefers only skinks. In terms of time of activity, most skinks tend to be diurnal. When I say diurnal, that it means that their most of the foraging happens during the day. And I'm sure many of you would have seen these skinks, which during the daytime. And when it gets really hot during the daytime, they can tend to go into burrows or go into already formed burrows or use other means of escape from the heat. There are also skinks that are nocturnal. For example, the Ophiomorus reitzmai, which is found in Thar Desert. So if any of you have been to Thar Desert or are planning to go there, when you wake up early in the morning and you go towards the dunes, many of these thickets in the dunes, you will notice that there are these sinusoidal tracks that lead towards these thickets. So these are basically tracks of uh, these Ophiomorus reitzmai skinks, and they move just under the top layer of the sand and leave behind these tracks, which you can see early in the morning. There are also crepuscular skinks, which means that they are active in times where the light is faded, for example, very, very early in the morning or late in the day, just while during sunset. So they actively forage during that time. Now, having said this, you will also find, and I'm sure a lot of you would have seen this, you will also find a lot of diurnal skinks that are actively foraging during either the crepuscular period or at night. Um, and what I have seen is I've largely noticed this in places that tend to be very, very hot during the day, which means that they don't, these skinks prefer not to go out, forage when it is very hot, and while it is still cooled down a bit, they go out and forage. Now, here are some other novelties in skinks. Some of skinks can also undergo color change. For example, the same species can have a different color during the day and during the night. Although this is definitely not as dramatic as geckos or agamids. There are reports of species. For example, there's this Trachylepis wrighti, which is reported to have dropped eggs from the nest, while there's another genus of skink called Liopisma, which are known to smash them on rocks and actually eat the eggs, eat the insides of the eggs. There's also a reports of skinks actually coming back to the site where they have lost their tail in order to eat it. Now, why would they do that? Because the tail is like the single largest repository of fat. So it contains more than 50% of the fat of the body, and therefore it is extremely nutritious, right? So, in case I haven't mentioned this earlier, skinks uh, have skinks can actually break their tail, and even after breaking their tail, it can actually regenerate. So this is called this breaking of the tail is called autotomy, and this breaking generally happens in these fracture planes on the tails. It can also break on either side of the fracture planes, but the rate of growth is definitely much less than what it would have been if it had broken in the fracture plane. Okay, so skinks are all, there are certain skinks that are also known to vocalize. For example, there is this skink called Tribolonotus, which is found in New Guinea Islands. And they have this weird squeaky sound. Just hold on, I'm going to play the video. All right, so these skinks generally make the sound only when they are threatened, but I don't think there are any reports that conclusively tell if these skinks use these vocalizations socially, whether they've used these vocalization in order for social communication. All right, so why should we work on skinks in India? Because obviously because it's an awesome study system for various streams of biological research, and I just showed how diverse the different traits in these lizards are, and therefore it'll be really interesting to actually find out how these different traits have evolved. Well, before that, we don't even know anything about these species. We don't know about the ecology of the species. We don't know about the natural history of the species. One good thing is that none of these skinks are scheduled, right? But that's probably also an artifact of very, very less work being done in India. And I'm sure we'll end up finding quite a few species which are restricted to extremely narrow ecoclimatic regions, which will therefore require a lot of protection. And a lot of times I've heard people complaining about these skinks are very difficult to find and difficult to catch and all that, but they're really abundant when you reach the right place. And you should definitely study because we don't know anything about them. Also, what makes skinks a very nice system is, what makes any system in India very interesting is the biogeographical history of India, because it has shared contact with Africa, Madagascar, Seychelles, and even after collision with Asia, there have been lineages, there have been biota that has dispersed into and out of India, and therefore what you have in India is kind of stuff that is really old and also stuff that is really new. So it's almost like an amalgamation of various different lineages, and these are the different genera of skinks that you find in the Indian subcontinent. And I have also included Sri Lanka as a part of the Indian subcontinent. I have not included Andaman and Nicobar as part of the Indian subcontinent because biogeographically, Andaman and Nicobar actually are more closely related to Southeast Asia. And while Andaman is more closely related to Myanmar, Nicobar Islands are more closely related to the Sunda region. So I've included the Indian and Sri Lankan skinks here. So you have 18 genera and you have around 80 species, which is obviously an underestimate because hardly any work has been done. And hopefully, with this presentation, it would have given you some impetus or some information for you to go out and actually do some work on skinks. Also, the skinks that you find in India are really, really beautiful. These are all Indian skinks. So this is a skink that we described from Meghalaya. It's called Spinomorphus apalpebratus. Remember I was talking about the palpebral slit. So this is another skink that actually lacks these palpebral slit. This is again Castlia that is found in Western Ghats. This is another species of Ryopa. This is a species of Exempliferus. All right. Okay, so that's about it. And all the lovely photographs that you've seen in this presentation none of them have been taken by me. Most of these photographs have been taken by Ishan Sonak, Deepak, Pratyush, Abhijit, Vijay, Zishan, and also Avrajal, who is also a PhD student of mine in NISA. I don't do photography, but I am world famous in handling the flash while doing photography. So I think that pretty much helps. All right, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much for an amazing session. What a fantastic session. Quite a few questions are piling up in the chat box. Can we just go through it and answer those?
Okay, so Shubham Soni says some of the comments from earlier are, I don't think, are very relevant, especially where Hari says that he's cooking right now. Shubham Soni says, where is the ear opening in subsurface? Can't see it. Yeah, well, the ear opening is actually hidden behind the scales. It's a very minute ear opening, and it also makes sense for the ear opening not to be exposed because these are fossorial creatures, and it would want some kind of covering over these ear openings. Somebody's asked, do we have any of the Prasinohema skinks in India? If so, in which parts? No, we do not have Prasinohema skinks in India. These are endemic to New Guinea islands. Are common skinks that we see in and around commonly poisonous ones? Okay, so there are no venomous or poisonous skinks, right? But I would so there are skinks that actually feed on dead and decaying matter, and therefore it is likely that their saliva might contain some bacteria, which if they bite and if it manages to puncture your skin, might result in infection. But there are no venomous or poisonous skinks. Okay, so there is one report of a cat eating a skink and suffering from neurological disorder. There's also a report of cat eating a skink and being half paralyzed for about an hour or so. But I think it was largely because of something that the skink might have eaten rather than any poison or venom in the skink. I have seen Eutropis species climbing straight up in the trees, but can they be called arboreal like Dacia? Do skinks have territorial fights? Okay, so yeah, Eutropis species do climb trees a lot, especially these really large Eutropis, for example, Eutropis carinata, because they have these really large claws. And I've seen them roost a lot in these tree holes, but they spend most of their time foraging on the ground. So therefore, I don't think you can really call them arboreal, just like Dacia, because Dacia spends pretty much all of its time on the trees. Do skinks have territorial fights? Yes, they do. Skinks are known to be highly territorial. In fact, if you, I've seen multiple times when you capture skinks, many of these have lost digits, and these are probably because there's been some territorial fight, or it's been bitten off during a fight, rather than being evolutionary lost, which I was talking about here. Most geckos have abilities to regenerate their tail like common house geckos. Do you mean to say that the regenerative capacity of skink proves that they are closely related to geckos? Um, No, so the skinks are not closely related to geckos, which is why I said that this trait of regeneration has actually appeared independently in multiple lineages. For example, there's an gamete. I think Laudakia has, which is found in northern India in the Himalayas. They also have the ability to regrow their tails, but they're obviously not related to geckos. Right? Why do skinks shed their tails? Well, uh, just like geckos. So when these tails actually shed, they keep wriggling, and they potentially, because they want to distract the predator, while the predator is still looking at the tail wriggling, they escape. Very informative lectures. Thank you. There is a common myth that if skinks lick, the person will die. Is it true? Are skinks poisonous generally? Shall we handle them with bare hand? Um, yeah, you can absolutely handle them with bare hand. And if a skink licks you, I think it only means that it loves you. Well, don't quote me on that, but which is the snake which prefers skinks as prey? So the only report I have is of an Australian skink which prefers skinks as prey. I don't remember the name off top of my head. Otherwise, I would have mentioned that in the talk. Um, what are a few common skinks found in Bangalore, and how do we go about searching for them? Um, the top of my head, some of the common skinks would be Eutropis macularia, carinata, Ryopa punctata, um, Eutropis bedomi, and they're pretty much there in all. If you just go to your garden, you should be able to see a Ryopa punctata. Many of these skinks have learned to live with human habitation. I wouldn't say they're commensal, but they are found very frequently in and around human habitation. Skins, any toxin present? Not that I know of. Why skinks basically sold at costlier rates online? Um, I'm not sure of the offline rates, so I'm not sure whether I can really answer that. Be okay if I contact you for future ID? Yes, please, sure. Um, what explains the diversity of adaptations in skinks, or this is comparable with diversity among other lizards? Um, See, many of these characters are also found in other lizard families, but I think skinks are unique largely because No, this whole gradation of limblessness that you see in skinks is not seen a lot in many of these other families. In geckos, you have limbless geckos. For example, pygopodids are completely limbless geckos, and it's a family of geckos, Pygopodidae, that you find in Australia, which are limbless. But here you have a system, same family, which has multiple lineages that portray like a gradation of limblessness within the same genus. So, for example, just to give you an example, in Sri Lanka there is this genus called Nesia, which has multiple species. So it's an endemic radiation within Sri Lanka, and there are examples of Nesia species which are pentadactyl, and there are examples of Nesia species which are completely limbless. So I think that's what makes skinks very interesting. Male territorial fights ever recorded in skinks? It's like it's seen in dragons and snakes. Uh, I'm not sure if it's ever been recorded. I haven't really searched for it, but I know that there are territorial fights that happen. Why skins are more bright? I'm assuming you mean why skinks are more bright. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why the scales of skinks are brighter or have more hue. Because many of times when you see skinks, so just like all the other squamates, these also shed their skin, right? And if it's an individual which has freshly shedded skin, it also has a hue, right? But remember that these are visible colors to us. Many of the predators, many of the predators or many of the individuals of skinks do not actually see colors like these. Rather, they see colors in more in the UV spectrum. So there are quite a few cases where it looks like a skink has really, let's say, it has gray brown patches and red patches, and to us the red patch looks really bright, and the gray brown patch looks really dull. But if you look at it through UV, then it appears like the gray brown patch is actually much more brighter, and therefore it would be much more conspicuous. Any mimicry related to skinks, and why do they have such a bright tail in a few families, as if it is meant to frighten predators or something? Yeah, I'm not sure if it's meant to frighten predators, but definitely to distract them. I think I also mentioned this before. Mimicry, I actually don't know of any instances where there is mimicry related to skinks. Um, how to count lamellae on digits of skinks? Okay, so this is a more technical thing. So uh, I would suggest that you go through some of the more taxonomic books on reptiles. For example, Malcolm Smith's uh, reptiles um, book. So that would be probably more helpful for you. Are there any studies on oral microbial community and gut content? So so I know there have been a few studies on gut content of uh, skinks where they've tried to look at whether there's coevolution between these gut flora. When you look at different species of skinks and you look at their gut flora, whether there's coevolution occurring between these. Apart from that, I'm not sure if there have been, maybe there are, but I'm not familiar with it. Do we see any sexual dimorphism as many skinks are brightly colored? Yes, there are quite a few skinks that are sexually dimorphic. the Eutropis macularia that I showed you. In fact, most of the pictures that I have on this presentation, the males tend during a particular season, with during the breeding season, the males tend to get these red regions on the flanks. But again, just some time back, I was telling you about visible colors and colors in the UV spectrum, right? So what is bright to us may not be bright to uh, member of the same species. So, but just to answer your question, they are sexually dimorphic. Any other predators except snakes which feed on skinks? Oh, multiple. Monitor lizards, a lot of birds. Birds really love, in fact, a lot of birds really love skinks. Can skinks hear? How good is their hearing? Skinks can hear, but I'm not sure how good their hearing ability is. They also have pretty good olfactory senses, the smelling sense. Apart from autotomy, what are their defensive techniques? Okay, so tail autotomy is definitely one of them. You remember I was talking to you about Tiliqua, the shingleback skink, it's also called the blue tongue skink. Well, so there's so it basically shows this blue tongue as a defensive technique. So it to frighten predators. So that's one. So this blue tongue is so generally in humans we get blue tongue when there's a lack of oxygen, but um, in these skinks they have this blue tongue because of a melanin pigmentation. What are the highest elevation skinks found in India? Exempliferus Himalayas. What is the highest elevation where skinks can be found? So in India, they have been spotted from Spiti, which is pretty high. I don't exactly remember how high Spiti is, but pretty high. Um, Please explain skink diversity and distribution in semi-arid grasslands. Okay, so that's. I'm not sure how to answer this question. There are quite a few species that are found in semi to arid grassland areas. You also find grassland species in the Western Ghats. So if you go to the Shola grasslands, you will find, so some of the Cassia you will find in Shola grasslands. But these other arid grasslands, I'm assuming many of these species would be much, much younger. For example, Eutropis and Ryopa are much younger lineages that have come in from Southeast Asia. So it is likely that many of them would have, uh, grassland, would find them close to grasslands, semi-arid grasslands. Just like snakes, do limbless skinks make use of belly scales to move? I'm not completely sure, but we've tried actually keeping a limbless skink on a plain floor, and it really struggled to move. But you give it some soil, and it just vanishes in no time. They're really, really efficient in digging through their nose and burrowing through. Oh, thank you very much. India, how many species in coastal sand beach? So I won't be able to remember this off the top of my head, but one of the species that I showed here was Eutropis bibroni, which is found mostly in coastal sandy areas. You also have Barkudia, which is from coastal sandy areas. Um, I don't know of any species that are in India, at least, which are exclusively found in coastal sandy areas. Any lost species in India yet to be discovered? Well,
I mean, rediscovered, it to be rediscovered.
Um, I don't think there's been enough work in skinks. Well, Sepsophis, for example, was rediscovered after 148 years, but that's purely because there's a lack of people working on skinks. There's a lack of people actually going out there and looking for these uh, lizards. So I can't think of any lost species which are waiting to be discovered. But I can definitely say that there are a lot of species that are unidentified and are waiting to be discovered. That is definitely there. Okay, so I think I've
Yeah.
finished all the questions.
Do you want to add a few more sentences? How to the new generation? How can they contribute to the studies of skinks in India?
So
Like people
well,
like us, we just look at them and how can we contribute?
yeah, well, so the thing is, the main problem I see right now is that a lot of people don't want to get into skinks because you have to start things from scratch, and there's not a lot of primary information available on skinks. Um, Frogs, for example, a lot of people are working on frogs, and therefore, when you go to a forest, you know what frogs you're looking at, what frog you're looking at. There are quite a few people working on geckos, and because of them, because of their work, when you go to the forest, you know what species you're looking at. But unfortunately, for skinks, uh, I've got quite a few emails that said, can you suggest a book on skinks? So unfortunately, there is no book on skinks, and that would have been really helpful. But I know that uh, hopefully very soon, ZSI is going to come up with Zoological Survey of India is going to come up with a book on Indian skinks, and I'm really really looking forward to it. I've seen a draft of it, and it looks really nice. So that should definitely be helpful. But in general, just there's a lot of material out there, reading material out there, and I think if you just read up enough on anything, you just get interested. So I would encourage people to read up more on skinks, and please, mail me or get in touch with me if you need any kind of help.
Okay, I think thank you so much. 1.5 hours. I mean, it was fantastic. We learned a lot, a lot of interesting stories across the globe and some Indian species also. And on behalf of Kottayam Nature Society and Alpine Naturalist Institute, thank you so much, Dr. Roy, and hope
Thanks,
to
David.
hear you from soon. Thank you so much. Good night, all of you, and stay safe.